On the night of September 6, 1870, the Royal Navy's newest and most radical warship sailed into a gale with violent squalls off the coast of Spain. Aboard HMS Captain was her creator, Captain Cowper Coles. For a decade, he had waged a relentless public campaign against the British Admiralty, eventually forcing them to build a revolutionary vessel that combined the heavy firepower of revolving iron turrets with the global range of a full sailing rig. Coles was enjoying the ultimate vindication of his life's work. The press hailed him as a patriotic genius. The public believed he had secured British naval supremacy for a generation. But just after midnight, a sudden squall caught the ship's massive sails. The wind pushed the dangerously low hull into the sea. The edge of the deck dipped beneath the waves. The ship lost all ability to right itself, and in an instant, the ironclad flipped completely upside down. HMS Captain plummeted to the bottom, taking 472 officers and men, including Cowper Coles, with her. The disaster shocked the British Empire, but to the Navy's own chief engineering expert, it was not a surprise. Edward James Reed had warned that the low freeboard, fully rigged design was dangerously compromised, but the ship-specific calculations that revealed the full scale of the danger were completed only shortly before the final voyage. How did an experienced naval officer and inventor, but not a trained naval architect, use the power of public opinion to override the warnings of professional design? And why did the world's most powerful navy agree to build a machine its own experts knew was an iron coffin? In the middle of the 19th century, the Royal Navy faced a mathematical and tactical crisis. For hundreds of years, naval supremacy had been built on a simple, effective premise: mount as many cannons as possible along the sides of a wooden hull. This was the broadside. It allowed a warship to unleash a devastating wall of fire, provided the enemy sailed directly parallel to the ship. But by the 1860s, the wooden wall was dead. The introduction of explosive shells and iron armor plating had changed the fundamental equations of naval combat. To pierce the iron hulls of rival fleets, naval guns had to grow exponentially. A cannon that once weighed 2 or 3 tons was suddenly replaced by massive rifled artillery weighing 12, then 20, and eventually 25 tons. This created a severe tactical bottleneck. A ship could no longer simply line up dozens of these mammoth weapons along its side. The immense weight of the new guns, combined with the heavy iron plating required to protect them, forced naval architects into a physical corner. To carry more broadside guns, the ship had to become longer. But a longer iron ship required a massive increase in structural weight and even more armor to cover that extended length. Worse, an incredibly long ironclad became sluggish and dangerously difficult to maneuver in battle. Furthermore, mounting guns in traditional broadside gun ports severely restricted their field of fire. They could only aim slightly forward or aft. A ship maneuvering in combat might find its heaviest weapons unable to bear on the target, while half of its firepower was always pointing at the empty ocean on the opposite side. The Admiralty's chief constructor, Edward James Reed, wrestled with this physical puzzle. Reed was a brilliant, mathematically rigorous professional. He understood that the Royal Navy was not merely a European coastal defense force. It was the mechanism that secured a global empire. Britain's warships had to patrol distant oceans where coal stations were scarce and unreliable. Therefore, any new heavy-gun ironclad still required a full rig of massive sails to cross the world without exhausting its fuel. The Navy needed a way to mount fewer, vastly heavier guns behind concentrated armor, allow them to fire in multiple directions, and still accommodate the towering masts and complex rigging required for global deployment. The Admiralty was desperately searching for a safe, incremental evolution. They wanted a measured, scientifically proven solution to the broadside bottleneck, tested in carefully controlled steps by professional shipbuilders. Instead, the answer was thrust upon them by a charismatic, fiercely ambitious naval captain who believed the entire system of broadside warfare should be scrapped overnight. He had a radical vision to concentrate naval firepower inside a revolving iron cylinder, and he was prepared to wage war against his own superiors to ensure his doctrine became a reality. Captain Cowper Coles was a man defined by boundless energy, supreme self-confidence, and limited formal training in the naval architectural calculations his radical designs demanded. A distinguished Royal Navy officer, his operational experience during the Crimean War had sparked a revelation. Faced with the need to bombard Russian positions in shallow water, Coles helped create Lady Nancy, a raft of casks and spars carrying a 32-pounder gun. The hemispherical shield belonged to the improved concept he developed afterward. From that improvised raft grew Coles's own turret campaign, one strand of a wider international revolution in armored naval gunnery. Coles recognized that the broadside bottleneck could be bypassed entirely. Instead of spreading dozens of guns along the hull, he proposed placing a few massive cannons on the ship's centerline, enclosed within heavily armored, revolving iron cylinders. He refined and patented this concept as the armored turret. The design solved the tactical problem brilliantly. A centerline turret could theoretically rotate to fire in any direction, tracking an enemy ship without requiring the vessel itself to turn. But this immense tactical advantage introduced a severe structural penalty. A revolving iron turret, complete with massive rifled guns, heavy armor plating, and internal turning machinery, represented an unprecedented concentration of physical weight placed high above the ship's center of gravity. For the Admiralty's naval architects, that concentrated top weight made a seaworthy ocean-going hull a problem of exact calculation. But Captain Coles had no patience for incremental development. He was entirely convinced of his own genius, and when the Admiralty moved too cautiously for his liking, he did not return to the drafting board to refine his math. He went to the newspapers. Coles launched an unprecedented public relations campaign. He wrote fiercely persuasive letters to the Times, cultivated influential members of Parliament, and distributed pamphlets to the nation's industrialists. He bypassed the official channels of naval procurement and presented his case directly to the British public. In his narrative, the story was simple. He was the visionary patriot, offering a miracle weapon that would guarantee the Empire's supremacy, while the Admiralty was a cabal of jealous, backwards-looking bureaucrats, terrified of innovation. The strategy was devastatingly effective. The British public, deeply invested in their unquestioned mastery of the seas, rallied behind the charismatic officer. For the first time, complex naval architecture was being litigated in the court of public opinion. Parliament began to aggressively question naval leadership, demanding to know why the professional engineers were ignoring the obvious solution to the future of warfare. Will the Navy hold the line against an amateur visionary, or yield to the fervor of the press? This public crusade deeply alarmed Chief Constructor Edward James Reed. Reed knew that Coles was an idea man who drew broad conceptual sketches without understanding the underlying physics of displacement, structural integrity, and stability. But the political momentum had become overwhelming. The public was effectively trying to dictate the design of a warship. Under immense pressure from Parliament and the press, the Admiralty realized they could no longer simply ignore Captain Coles. They had to appease the national mood before it threatened their funding and political authority. In an attempt to quiet the relentless inventor, the Admiralty authorized their own professionals to design a turret ship that incorporated Coles's weapons into a mathematically safe hull. It was intended to be a sensible compromise. Instead, it only enraged the visionary further, setting the stage for a bitter showdown over the blueprints of the ultimate warship. The resulting ship was HMS Monarch, a professional Admiralty design built around Cowper Coles' heavy revolving turrets. The wind's immense sideways leverage on Monarch's full sailing rig demanded high sides to keep the hull from being pressed underwater. Reed therefore gave her a safe, traditional freeboard, the height of the hull above the waterline of 14 feet. Captain Coles despised it. To him, a high freeboard ruined the very essence of the turret ship concept. High sides meant a larger target for enemy gunners, requiring hundreds of tons of extra iron armor to protect. Furthermore, Reed's high-sided design required a raised forecastle at the bow, which physically blocked the turrets from firing straight ahead. Coles demanded a pure turret ship, an ultra-low freeboard of just 8 feet, presenting a tiny, heavily armored target to the enemy. Furious that the Admiralty had compromised his vision, Coles returned to his allies in the newspapers. The pressure reached a boiling point as the press demanded that he be allowed to build his own ship, his own way, without bureaucratic interference. The decisive authorization came not from Hugh Childers, but from his predecessor, Sir John Pakington. Under pressure to test Coles's claims, Pakington's Admiralty approved a rival turret ship built outside the Navy's normal design process. Because Coles was not a trained naval architect, he was forced to partner with a commercial builder to translate his sketches into a real vessel. He selected Laird Brothers, a highly respected private shipyard in Birkenhead. But this unprecedented political concession came with a chilling administrative caveat. Initial responsibility for the design was placed on Coles and Laird Brothers, while the Admiralty's own constructive department distanced itself from the concept. Yet the Navy still retained powers of inspection, acceptance, and the final decision to send the completed ship to sea. The division of responsibility was never clean. Coles and Laird carried the principal design burden, but once the Navy accepted Captain for trials, Admiralty officials also became responsible for judging whether she was fit to sail. A new question now hung over the project. Could a private shipyard successfully deliver a radical concept that the Navy's own chief architect adamantly refused to build? Laird Brothers found themselves trapped in an impossible position. They were contractually bound to execute Coles' rigid demands for an 8-foot freeboard, enormous centerline turrets, and a towering oceanic sailing rig. They had to balance the visionary's relentless optimism with the harsh realities of displacement and structural steel. The political war was finally over. The contract for HMS Captain was signed, and Coles had achieved his impossible victory. But as the abstract ideas were formalized into exact physical blueprints, the mathematical reality of what they were attempting to build began to terrify the chief constructor. When the preliminary blueprints for HMS Captain arrived at the Admiralty, Chief Constructor Edward James Reed laid them out and saw a mathematical death sentence. The British public saw a marvel of modern naval engineering, but Reed looked at the lines drawn by Laird Brothers and saw a fatal collision of competing physical demands. Why is the combination of an ocean-going sailing rig and an ultra-low hull so uniquely deadly? To understand Reed's terror, one must look at the exact physical forces Captain Cowper Coles had forced the private shipyard to combine. The required sailing rig created a direct conflict with the turret system. The thick web of ropes supporting traditional masts would obstruct rotation and ruin the clear firing arc at the center of the design. To solve this, Coles and the builders chose a radical alternative: tripod masts. Instead of a web of ropes, the towering masts would be supported by immense, rigid iron legs. The advantage was a perfectly clear field of fire for the massive 25-ton guns housed inside the armored cylinders below. The trade-off, however, was mechanically disastrous. The tripod masts and the vast sail plan added weight and wind leverage high above the waterline, contributing to an already elevated center of gravity. Furthermore, when strong ocean winds caught the immense spread of canvas sails mounted on these metal legs, the entire structure acted like a colossal crowbar. The wind applied leverage at the top of the masts, aggressively pushing the ship to tilt, or heel, over onto its side in the water. In a stable warship, The first resistance to heeling is often described through metacentric height, a measure of initial stability at small angles. As the angle increases, naval architects follow the righting arm, the changing lever through which buoyancy works to return the ship upright. As a ship heels over, the buoyant volume of its tall hull presses deeper into the sea, generating a powerful upward force that fights the wind and stands the vessel back up. The taller the sides of the ship, the longer this righting lever can continue to push back against the wind. But this invisible force relies entirely on the geometry of the hull remaining above the water. And this is where Coles' rigid demands doomed the blueprint. To keep the ship a small target and save thousands of tons of heavy iron armor, Coles had insisted on an ultra-low freeboard, the height of the exposed hull above the water. On the Laird brothers' blueprints, the distance from the waterline to the main deck was exactly 8 feet. Reed did the math. As the wind pushed against the towering tripod masts, the ship would naturally lean. But because there were only 8 feet of hull above the water, it would not take much of a lean before the edge of the deck plunged beneath the waves. The chief constructor focused on the first terrifying threshold. At roughly 14 degrees of heel, the edge of Captain's main deck would begin to submerge. That did not erase her righting force in an instant. The calculated righting moment continued to rise to a maximum near 21 degrees and vanished only at about 54. But once the deck edge went under, water could sweep across the low hull, wind could press beneath the hurricane deck, and the ship's already narrow reserve of stability could be consumed with terrifying speed. Reed was horrified by the principle. In reports and public technical arguments, he repeatedly warned that low freeboard, tall masts, heavy sail, and elevated weights were a dangerous combination for an ocean-going turret ship. What he did not produce was a definitive pre-launch calculation proving that the completed Captain must capsize in an ordinary gale. But no single warning stopped the project. Responsibility was divided. The final stability calculations came late, and no official converted the accumulating doubts into an order that kept Captain in port. The fatal equation had been approved on paper, but as construction finally began at the Birkenhead shipyard, the mathematics of the disaster were about to get even worse. The keel of HMS Captain was laid at the Laird brothers' shipyard in Birkenhead in January 1867. Translating Coles' conflicting requirements into physical steel demanded immense support beneath the 2 armored turrets and towering tripod masts. To keep the shallow hull from buckling under their concentrated weight and leverage, Laird's added thicker iron plates, heavier transverse deck beams, and denser internal bracing. But in naval architecture, every solution has a cost. And the cost of this vital reinforcement was relentless weight creep. The fundamental law of displacement dictates that a ship must displace its own weight in water. Therefore, every extra ton of steel added during construction forces the hull to sit deeper in the ocean. As construction dragged on over 3 years, the ounces and pounds accumulated into hundreds of tons. Coles, fixated on maximizing the ship's offensive power, frequently requested alterations and additional fittings, further adding to the physical burden. Admiralty oversight existed, but it was fragmented and insufficient to control the ship's growing displacement. Plans were examined, inspections were made, and concerns were raised, yet no unified weight control process prevented the design from drifting far beyond its original margins. When HMS Captain was finally completed and fully loaded with coal, ammunition, and her crew, the true cost of the compromise was revealed. Will the ship hit its incredibly tight design margins? The answer was a staggering failure. The vessel emerged roughly 700 to 800 tons heavier than intended. This massive discrepancy had a terrifying consequence for the vessel's survival. Instead of floating at the planned 8-foot freeboard, Captain sat about 2 feet deeper in the water. For a warship of nearly 8,000 tons designed to brave the Atlantic, the new reality was extraordinary. Her operational freeboard was only about 6 to 6.5 feet. A tall man standing on the main deck could lean over the railing and almost touch the ocean. With the deck edge now roughly 2 feet closer to the waterline than planned, the angle required to submerge it had narrowed accordingly. By any professional calculation, HMS Captain was a disaster waiting for a stiff breeze. The physical margins for error had been entirely erased by the weight creep of its own construction. Yet, despite sitting dangerously low in the water, the gleaming new warship went to sea for its initial trials in the spring of 1870. And, to the astonishment of the naval establishment, it seemed to prove all the critics wrong. When HMS Captain finally raised her anchor in the spring of 1870, she presented a silhouette unlike anything the world had ever seen. The hull sat so incredibly low that the sea practically lapped at the main deck. Yet rising from this tiny platform were 2 colossal armored turrets and a towering array of iron tripod masts. It looked less like a traditional warship and more like a heavy coastal fortress that had miraculously sprouted an oceanic sailing rig. As the ship began her initial trials, the British public, the press, and the politicians watched with intense anticipation. The fundamental question was finally being tested in reality. Were Chief Constructor Edward James Reed and the mathematical experts actually wrong? For the first few months, the answer seemed to be a resounding yes. Captain performed impressively during her early cruises, and official reports were broadly favorable. But the trials were not confined to exceptionally mild weather. She sailed in winds reported around force 5 to 7, and witnesses also recorded heavy lurches, including one to roughly 21 degrees. The success was real enough to reassure her officers, yet the warning signs were already there. When the massive 25-ton guns fired, the turrets worked as intended, and the ship completed her gunnery trials successfully. Furthermore, under light breezes, the vast spread of canvas on the tripod masts pulled the heavily armored vessel along with surprising grace, allowing her to keep pace with the rest of the fleet. The functioning turrets and favorable cruises masked the vessel's instability from public view. The press declared victory over the cautious Admiralty bureaucracy, and Captain Cowper Coles was hailed as a national hero who had defeated the naval establishment. The vessel's operational credibility was cemented by her commander, Captain Hugh Burgoyne. Burgoyne was an elite officer, a Victoria Cross recipient known for his exceptional seamanship and calm under pressure. With a crew of nearly 500 highly trained sailors working the guns and the rigging, the ship projected an aura of total invincibility. Coles came aboard as Captain Burgoyne's guest and remained with the ship through the experimental cruises. He was completely enraptured by the physical realization of his lifelong obsession. He ate, slept, and observed the exercises from inside the ironclad he had willed into existence, entirely consumed by his own creation. Yet the Admiralty's concern persisted. On July 29th, dockyard engineers conducted an inclining experiment to establish the ship's center of gravity. The full calculations were completed only in late August, and the results were neither effectively communicated to Captain Burgoyne nor converted into restrictions before the final cruise. Reed resigned in July 1870 amid broader disputes over Admiralty policy and proposed warship construction. By the time Captain's full stability curve was completed, the Navy's most forceful critic of the concept was no longer in office. The following month, HMS Captain received her orders. She was to join the prestigious Channel Squadron for her first major oceanic deployment off the coast of Spain. Coles sailed with his ship, eager to watch his masterpiece dominate the high seas. He was convinced he had revolutionized the world, He was sailing directly into a gale. By the evening of September 6, 1870, HMS Captain was sailing off Cape Finisterre with a combined fleet drawn from the Channel and Mediterranean squadrons. The barometer began to drop, and the sky darkened as a standard Atlantic gale swept in. For the traditional, high-sided wooden and iron warships of the British fleet, the worsening weather was a routine inconvenience. They shortened their sails, rode the heavy ocean swells, and maintained their formations. But aboard HMS Captain, the situation was rapidly becoming a fight against the fundamental laws of physics. Captain Hugh Burgoyne was on the weather deck, managing the ship as the wind intensified. Below decks, the crew, including the visionary Captain Cowper Coles and midshipman Leonard Childers, the son of the First Lord of the Admiralty who had approved the vessel, were resting in their hammocks. As the gale strengthened, wind loaded the vast sail plan high above the already vulnerable hull, forcing the ship to heel sharply to starboard. How fast does a mathematically flawed design fail in the real world? Just after midnight, a sudden, violent squall struck the squadron. A wall of wind slammed into HMS Captain. Captain Burgoyne shouted for the foretopsail halyards and the fore and main topsail sheets to be let go, trying to strip pressure from the rig. But the ship was already leaning too far over. Only 6.5 feet of freeboard remained. As the squall forced the vessel over, that margin vanished in seconds. The edge of the deck plunged beneath the boiling sea. Water swept across the low deck as the hull continued to heel and vulnerable openings approached the sea. The remaining reserve was consumed until recovery was no longer possible. Survivor testimonies from the subsequent court-martial described a catastrophe of catastrophe eyes. The ship did not slowly founder, it was actively driven into the sea. Survivors described the ship continuing to heel, pausing briefly, then rolling farther as another sea struck. As the angle increased, the sea poured down the ship's funnels, extinguishing the boiler fires with a deafening roar of steam. Within 3 minutes of the squall hitting, HMS Captain flipped completely upside down. The iron hull floated bottom up for several minutes before trapped air escaped, flooding increased, and the inverted ship sank beneath the darkness. The human cost was absolute. Captain Cowper Coles, the man who had waged a decade-long crusade to see his vision built, drowned inside the iron cylinder of his own creation. Captain Burgoyne was washed from the hull and lost to the sea, along with midshipman Childers. Out of a highly trained crew of roughly 500 men, only 18 sailors managed to scramble onto a floating launch and survive the night. When dawn broke, the rest of the Channel Squadron looked out across the turbulent water. The most anticipated warship in the world was simply gone, leaving only a few pieces of shattered wood floating on the surface. The tragedy shocked the British Empire to its core, but the loss of the iron coffin fundamentally altered how warships would be designed forever. When the news of the sinking reached London, the nation was paralyzed by grief and disbelief. The press, which had spent years championing Captain Cowper Coles as the infallible savior of the Royal Navy, suddenly demanded answers. A formal Admiralty court-martial was convened, ostensibly to investigate the loss of the ship. But the inquiry quickly transformed into a profound reckoning over how the world's most powerful fleet procured its weapons. The proceedings examined the fatal administrative chain through the blueprints, the delayed inclining experiment, and the stark memorandums written by former Chief Constructor Edward James Reed. What did the loss of HMS Captain actually achieve? The answer began with a historic legal verdict. The 18 survivors were formally acquitted, while the verdict found that the sail carried would not have endangered a ship with proper stability, effectively clearing Captain Burgoyne's handling of the vessel. Remarkably, the verdict did not reduce the catastrophe to one guilty party. It noted that Captain had been built in deference to public opinion and against the general views of the controller's department. But it also cited the grave departure from the original design, the roughly 2-foot increase in draft, the dangerously small stability, the excessive sail area, and the failure either to communicate those facts or establish them before the ship entered regular service. The scandal was not simply that the press had won. It was that political pressure, divided responsibility, design drift, and late calculation had converged aboard one ship, and 472 people had paid the price. The disaster triggered a searching review of design responsibility inside the Admiralty. It weakened the idea that a charismatic inventor could bypass professional scrutiny, and it strengthened the authority of naval architects who demanded measurable evidence of stability. Reed's long-standing objections were powerfully vindicated, even though the record did not support every later claim that he had predicted the exact disaster. Naval architecture was not transformed overnight, and no single law suddenly made every stability curve a prerequisite before a keel was laid. But Captain's loss accelerated the movement toward full curves of stability, better weight control, and more rigorous calculation, methods that remained laborious until mechanical integrators made them practical on a wider scale in the 1880s. The professional engineer had not won a clean victory. He had won a terrible warning. But the most lasting consequence of HMS Captain was what it did to the warship itself. The disaster exposed the extreme contradiction at the heart of Captain's particular design. A low freeboard hull could carry heavy turrets, and a turret ship could carry sail, as HMS Monarch demonstrated. But combining Captain's very low deck, elevated weights, broad hurricane deck, and vast ocean-going rig left almost no margin when wind and sea acted together. The problem was not a universal law that turrets and sail could never coexist. It was that this combination pushed them past the safe limit. If the heavy revolving turret was the future, the pressure to abandon full sailing rigs had become overwhelming. Before he resigned, Edward James Reed had already designed the mastless answer. HMS Devastation had been laid down in November 1869, 10 months before Captain sank, and the disaster prompted further scrutiny of a ship already under construction. It carried massive, centerline armored turrets on a low freeboard, entirely validating Coles' concept for firepower and protection. But Devastator possessed no sails, no tripod masts, and no sailing rigging. It relied entirely on vast coal bunkers and steam engines to cross the ocean. She became the first mastless, ocean-going capital ship designed to rely on steam rather than auxiliary sail, and she helped establish the layout that later capital ships would follow. Captain Cowper Coles had won part of his argument, but the triumph was bitterly ironic. His revolving turret helped shape the future of naval warfare, while the towering masts and sails he insisted on preserving gave way to mastless steam power. He was neither merely a foolish amateur, nor the infallible genius invented by the newspapers, but a tragic visionary who saw the future of naval firepower and was consumed by the most extreme version of his own compromise. Today, one physical legacy of this technological turning point remains somewhere on the seabed off Cape Finisterre. A wreck surveyed in 2022 resembles Captain in general configuration, but it has not yet been positively identified. Another legacy is mounted on the walls of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Two large brass wall panels list Captain Burgoyne, Captain Coles, Midshipman Childers, and the hundreds of officers and men who died. The panels preserve the names of the officers and men lost aboard a ship whose dangers were understood too late.